Hey everyone, I'm Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com, and today sees the launch of the RTX 2080 Super graphics card from Nvidia. So we thought, well, it's only right to get a few different models in. Let's take a look at 3 AIB cards. So essentially what I've got here are 3 different cards, kind of various price points, various brands, and that also means kind of something slightly different about each one. So let's start with the Palit. So this is actually the Palit GameRock edition. From what I can tell, they're actually going to have 2 different versions, the GameRock and then the GameRock Premium. The GameRock Premium means that it's going to come with a slightly higher kind of overclock straight out the factory, whereas this actually has exactly the same clock speeds as the Nvidia Reference or Founders Edition card. So that means that we have a boost clock of 1815 megahertz. Memory speed is clocked at a weird 1938 megahertz, and I guess the only kind of key takeaway from the Palit version is going to be down to the cooler. So we are expecting good things when it comes to at least the performance of acoustics, sort of maybe even power consumption, and of course temperatures due to the dual fan design on here. Now I don't actually want to go over kind of the coolers too much because I feel like I am a little bit flogging a kind of dead horse, because we actually looked at a 2070 Super version which had exactly the same cooler on here. So essentially, and I will go over it just really quickly, we have 2 twin fans on here, a little bit of RGB on here, GameRock kind of branding and styling, which is going to be a bit of a love-hate for some people, but it does take up just over kind of 2 slots inside your chassis. It has 2 8-pin power connectors compared to the Founders Edition, which has an 8-pin and a 6-pin, purely down to that beefier cooler. It does have the large backplate on there as well with the GameRock sort of branding, and then typically, just like the kind of Founders Edition, we have exactly the same connectors on here. So nothing really to shout home about. It's kind of the same cooler, they've just taken it off of, I guess, all the existing graphics cards and slapped it on here. But when it comes to pricing, this is probably where it's going to be, I guess, a little bit surprising for you. So the Founders Edition actually comes in at $699 in the US and £669 in the UK at the time of launch. The Palit card is actually going to be coming in at MSRP with this. Obviously, I did mention that there is a premium version which will have slightly kind of improved overclocks, and with that, yeah, you're probably going to look at maybe about a $20 difference. Now, the one thing that's a little bit disappointing with this card, and I said the same with the 2070 Super, is it doesn't actually have a 0 decibel kind of mode when you're on this BIOS switch. Now, the weird thing is this has got kind of your factory clock speeds on there. So it has got a little BIOS switch on there to switch it over to, I guess, Profile 1, which is your kind of bog standard speeds. But with this being the non-premium version, the bog standard speeds are the same on both BIOSes. Kind of a little bit, yeah, wondering why it's even got the BIOS switch to start with if it's not already a pre-factory overclock kind of card compared to, I guess, the Founders Edition. So there you go, bit of a weird one, but we will move on. The next one that we have up is from Gigabyte. So this is the Gaming OC. Again, I have looked at a 2070 and also a 2060 Gaming OC. So again, there's not really that much to kind of go on about. It does take up 2 slots in your case, has a triple cooler WindForce 3X design, and with this it actually stays true to kind of the Founders Edition with the 8-pin and the 6-pin. Has a large metal backplate on there, and connector wise, again, we do see the typical DisplayPort, HDMI, and then the Virtual Link USB Type-C on there. So again, nothing really out of the ordinary. And when it comes to the clock speeds, we are looking at, again, 1815 on the boost. Now, the one that does make a slight bit of a difference is this beastie bad boy here. So this is the Zotac 2080 Super Amp Extreme. Now, obviously being an Amp Extreme, it is kind of their top end model. And with this, we do kind of expect 2 8-pin power connectors. You can see the fan or cooler design on it, triple fan with the Ice Storm, and it has this kind of RGB effect on there. Now I'm gonna be honest, when the RGB's not on, it does look a little bit cheap and nasty. It's very kind of plasticky and just doesn't really do much for the eye, I've got to admit. But when it's on and you've got the RGB going, it actually does look really nice on there. Other RGB on there is, of course, the Zotac Gaming logo. Now, the weird thing is we actually looked at the 2070 Super, which had, or it was the Amp Extreme, but it had a slightly different cooler on there. So what they've actually done is kind of reserved this cooler for the 2080 Super and also the 2080 Ti. Now, you can see this actually takes up a lot more room in your chassis, so maybe even 3 slots, maybe just below. But yeah, it's not exactly for the faint-hearted. You have got a large backplate on there as well, with kind of some subtle branding, Live to Game and the Zotac logo, and in typical fashion, it does kind of wrap round to the side. In terms of the connectors on here, bit of a weird one, because this is, I guess, the most extreme card that we have out of the three, but it's actually missing the USB Type-C for virtual link. So anyone who's kind of, wanting to go down the route of, I guess, virtual reality headsets, well, you're gonna have to either buy the Palit card or the Gigabyte card, because this just doesn't have it, which is really odd, considering how beefy and beastly this card is. So I've got to ask, why is it missing such a fundamental feature for a card that is, I guess, so extreme? I mean, the clue's in the name, right? Now, when you look at the clock speed on that, that's where this kind of slightly differs. As I mentioned, we have the Founders Edition, clocking in with a boost clock of 1815, same with the Gigabyte and same with the Palit, but the Zotac card comes in ever so slightly improved on that. It actually comes in at 1875. So we do have a ever so slight kind of factory overclock, and that probably explains why we have this beefy cooler on there. Memory sort of speed-wise, they are the same on all the cards at 1938. Bit of a weird number, but I digress. So I guess we need to look at, yes, this comes with kind of, a higher boost clock, but we've still got to overclock all these cards. So let's see exactly how they do. So starting with the Gigabyte RTX 2080 Super Gaming OC. Obviously it comes with a default clock of 1650, we was actually able to take this to 1730. Consequently, that meant that the boost speed went from the kind of pre-factory overclocked 1845 MHz all the way up to 1925. So this basically means we was able to put through another 80 MHz on the core clock. When it came to the memory, we was able to get up another whopping 1400 MHz. That means we actually took it from 1938 MHz up to 2288 MHz. A huge jump. When looking at the Palit RTX 2080 Super GameRock, we was able to take that from its kind of 1650 core clock up to 1780 by adding 130 MHz onto it. That means that the boost clock went from its standard 1815 MHz up to 1945 MHz. The memory, we actually managed to max it out. We couldn't actually go any further. We added 1500 MHz onto the memory clock, taking it from 1938 MHz all the way up to a stonking 2313 MHz. Lastly, with the Zotac Amp Extreme, you got to remember that straight out of the gate from the factory, it does come with a slightly higher overclock, so we wasn't expecting it to go as far. With that in mind, we were still able to push it 65 MHz on the core clock, taking it from 1650 all the way up to 1715, and the boost clock went from 1875 up to 1940 MHz. Also on the memory, we was able to max it out completely in MSI Afterburner by taking it up 1500 MHz, taking it from 1938 MHz up to 2313 MHz. So when looking at the overclocking, I was actually pretty surprised. Now, I know this obviously has the beefier cooler, this has a triple fan on there, but it was actually the Palit card that we was able to push kind of that little bit further in terms of obviously raw performance gains. So yes, you could overclock one card to this and one card to that. I mean, in theory, this is already kind of pre-factory overclock, so we was expecting, I guess, this to go not as far as, say, some of the other ones, because it's already kind of partly way there. But the Palit actually surprised us the most. It seems like maybe this is the best cooling solution to really sort of, keep the temperatures down to give you that increased kind of overclock when it comes to sort of looking at the performance that we showed you in 3D Mark Firestrike as well as Ghost Recon Wildlands. Now, without further ado, I guess it's time to look at kind of raw performance straight out the gate with all of these cards and even compared to the Founders Edition. Roll them glorious benchmarks. So there you have it. I guess in the grand scheme of things, and I've actually got a video specifically on the Founders Edition, I said, I mean, what we have here is a card that's kind of pitted to go between a 2070 Super and a 2080 Ti, and it fell exactly there. Obviously with these cards, they are slightly improved. Now, even though they have the same clock speeds, at least two of them, as the Founders Edition, they did perform ever so slightly better. Now this is, a lot of it's gonna come down to sort of thermal throttling. So while this is a very, very stylish cooler, it's maybe not the best cooler in the world. Whereas these can kind of handle just being able to kind of be, I guess, boost performance for a more prolonged amount of time. And that's kind of what it's all about. Obviously the Zotac did, I guess, pit most of these cards to the punch in a majority of the tests, but when you actually look at the difference between it, there was only maybe 1 or 2 frames in most games, even at sort of 1080p all the way through to 4K. So, I mean, for the extra kind of price, and I will talk about pricing on all these cards, is the Zotac maybe worth, I guess, the extra? So let's talk about price so we can actually dissect them results just a little bit better. So pricing wise, this is a little bit of a weird one because obviously I'm based in the UK, but we have a lot of kind of viewers in the US and the UK. So I have to try and find pricing on all these cards. Now the problem is a lot of people, I guess the retailers, aren't actually aware of what their pricing is going to be until the actual day of launch. So I'm going to try and sort of muddle through as best as I can and sort of, you know, I guess give you my indications as to where I think it's going to lie. So starting with the Founders Edition, obviously we know this is priced at $699 MSRP in the US and $669 in the UK. Moving over to the Palit card, this is actually going to be priced at $699 in the US as an MSRP. The problem that we have with that is Palit aren't actually available in the US. But as we know, most pricing in kind of the tech world is based on US pricing. So they've kind of had to say, right, we are going to hit the MSRP as a, I guess, to match with the Founders card. So then that will equate to whatever kind of rate they get, pound versus dollar. Bit of a confusing one, but please sort of stick with me with it. So obviously there is a premium edition, which will have a slight overclock on it. And as I mentioned earlier, you're probably going to be looking at about a 20, maybe even a £30 premium. So that's down to, I guess, when you see the performance results of how far the overclock can be pushed, as to kind of if it's worth it or not. So moving over to the Gigabyte card, obviously when we look at the MSRP for the Founders Edition, $669 in the UK, this is actually going to be coming in at £20 more expensive, so $689.99. Now, normally in the stack, Gigabyte would have a Windforce OC card, which would essentially have kind of a dual cooler on there, but on the 2080 series, that just doesn't exist. There's simply this model and then an Aorus edition, which is probably going to come in at around $729.99, but will have the beefier cooler and the even beefier overclocks on there. Now, the Zotac is where it gets interesting. Obviously, this card is, I guess, at least in aesthetics way, is the most extreme looking, and when you look at the performance of kind of clock speed and things like that, again, is the most extreme. So with that, we are looking at a slightly more extreme price tag. Are you ready? Sit down, hold onto your hat, $739.99. So in the US, I'm guessing it's gonna come in at about $789. That is an extreme price point kind of hike from a Founders Edition or an almost Founders Edition or an ever so slightly above Founders Edition pricing. So take from that what you will. You guys have seen the benchmarks, you've seen the overclocks, you know exactly what these cards are all about. Is that really worth that much more than these 3 cards, which are similarly priced? I don't know, only you can decide that one. It's up to you guys. Let me know in the comments section below. I'd be really interested to sort of see, would you be looking at MSRP pricing, MSRP pricing, ever so slightly kind of increased MSRP pricing, or something that's getting even closer to a 2080 Ti pricing? Who knows? Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, you know exactly what to do, and I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye. Hey everyone, I'm Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com, and today sees the launch of the NVIDIA... Why is it missing such a fundamental feature? So yeah, I lent on that and I was like, fundamental feature. That's a lot of money. There's a spat everywhere.
Oh, grim.